The modern democracy relies on large participation of citizens in the decision-making process. This is what democracy is about. In this context, the European institutions and the member states have often emphasized the importance of engaging the youth and bringing it into a decision-making process. The aim is to push for young people's engagement and strengthen its contribution to the development of democracy in general throughout the European continent. The treaties of the EU themselves say that the Union should encourage the participation of young people in the democratic life of the Union. However, if we look at the actual turnout in the last EU elections of May 2014, young citizens, particularly those between 18 and 24 years old, were again the greatest abstainers. And paradoxically, they are the ones who express the most positive feelings about the EU. If we look at the statistics at the Eurobarometer, we see that 54% of young EU citizens believe that membership of their country to the EU is a good thing. I think that a drop in the usual ways of participation, in particular political participation of the youth, has sometimes led to the impression and to the wrong judgments regarding the actual interests of young people to contribute at shaping their environment. Just because they don't participate in the traditional ways of political participation doesn't mean they are not interested in shaping their own future. On the contrary. Because the political processes are so complex, young people feel excluded from the mainstream politics. And they believe that the issues they really care about are not considered by the decision makers. On the other hand, political institutions are failing to make the most of the new media and failing to engage young voters through the channels that these voters prefer to use. The studies also show that young people tend to choose new forms of political participation, in particular political or civil activisms that take place over the internet and specifically through the new social media. The absenteeism of young people is related to many reasons. Among these, there is also the fact that political parties, as well as the EU institutions, have not yet fully taken into account the changes in the young people's form of political participation, and particularly these new forms of communication between young people or between young people and the institutions and the parties. Moreover, there is a certain degree of distrust between the citizens in general and the institutions. Among the most popular reasons for not voting in the EU elections of 2014, for example, there was the lack of trust and interest in politics in general. And again, politics in general, not only that of the EU institutions. Young people tend to feel that traditional forms of participation are insufficient to influence policy making in areas that are really important to them. They don't feel that their interests are well represented by the elected politicians, and nor do they feel that their voices are really heard. And what it is most important is that it is difficult for the youth to engage in EU politics because the differences in the views of the mainstream political families are really hard to find. And there's a good reason why these differences are so hard to spot. Take, for example, the voting in the European Parliament. Since the beginning of the new parliamentary term, the 2014-2019 parliamentary term, the two main parties, the People's Party and the Socialists, have voted exactly the same way in 4 out of every 5 recorded votes. For this reason, the European parties struggle really hard to profile themselves and to convince the voters in general, and young voters in particular, why they should actually vote for this party and not for the other one. And the difficulty stands particularly in the fact that their agendas at the European level are, or at least appear to be, very similar. But let's come back to the ways the youth now chooses to engage in the civic life. I believe that the changes in the political engagement that I mentioned earlier are linked to a new understanding of citizenship. It is true that today the ways of taking part in the social life of young people are really different from those of past generations. Other phenomena like globalization, like consumption, like greater competition are also influencing the way that people are thinking, and particularly the young people. The figures also show that the level of participation of young people in the elections depends on their level of education. That is, the higher the level of education, the more likely it is that they will actually turn out to vote. It is clear that the socio-economic factors can constitute a strong reason for youth disengagement. A report published last year by the European Youth Forum shows that the typical young abstainer is a woman under the age of 25, who sees herself as belonging to the lower tiers of the society, who has only secondary education, and who is engaged in either manual employment or is not working at all. Another reason for youth disengagement is that citizens in general and young people in particular tend to believe in the fact that in the European Parliament the decisions are taken following a national logic. However, as we show at VoteWatch, politics in the European Parliament is much more about ideology than nationality. For example, it is much more likely that a conservative MEP from, say, Germany votes the same way as a conservative from Spain, and very differently from a German socialist. The rate of cohesion of the EU political groups is rather high, and so is what we call the loyalty of individual members of the European Parliament towards their European political groups. That is, the extent in which each individual MEP votes along the European political group line. The crisis of the last years in Europe has many consequences. One of these is the further exclusion of the vulnerable groups of people from the democratic life. This is because the access to employment or the secure housing is more difficult, and as long as people are concerned with the primary needs, they are unlikely to get involved in the civic life, except perhaps in the ad hoc and sometimes violent way of expression. Participation in the democratic life of a society is tightly linked to the actual level of inclusion into that society. Obviously, the more you feel that you are part of a community, the more likely you are to take part in the decision-making of that community. Many EU projects note the connection between employment, the social stability, and political or civic participation. In other words, higher level of education and employment can lead to greater chances of civic and political participation of the citizens. On the other hand, the current economic situation has brought some excluded groups of young people onto the streets and to the ballot box in acts of political protest. We know that in some cases this has been translated into a protest vote in favor of more radical parties at the extreme right or the extreme left. The European Union funds many projects related to youth. The unit in the European Commission in charge of youth is the Directorate General for Education and Culture. This is the executive branch of the European Union who is responsible for policy on education, culture, youth, languages, and sports. Through this unit, the EU supports a variety of projects or programs. The most known of these programs is the Erasmus+, which aims to improve education and training in Europe, while providing young people and people in general at any stage of their life with learning opportunities. And then there is also the Creative Europe program, which finances hundreds of projects in support of artists, actors, musicians, among others, and aims at promoting cultural diversity and intercultural dialogue. The European Parliament, for its part, this other institution, has also developed various initiatives to encourage young people's engagement. I remember that in 2008, it launched the Charlemagne Youth Prize, which is awarded to projects promoting European and international understanding, and also offers practical examples of Europeans living together as one community. And then in May 2014, in the run-up to the previous European elections, the Parliament organized the European Youth Event, which took place in the premises of the Parliament in Strasbourg. This functioned as a forum to share ideas and opinions on issues such as youth unemployment, the digital revolution, the future of the EU, and European values in general. The event was attended by quite a few people, about 6,000 young people, aged between 16 and 30 from all across Europe attended this very important event. Since its foundation, VoteWatch Europe has worked for improving the transparency of the EU decision-making process in order to generate greater interest in the EU politics. This is not at all an easy job. The goal has been carried out by producing high-quality information, particularly on the voting records of the EU institutions. For years now, it is possible to learn, through our website, how each member of the European Parliament voted on every single issue that this institution has dealt with, which is obviously a great deal of information available to the citizens, which can be used to hold their representatives accountable. In the run-up to the European elections in 2014, we developed two separate projects that aimed at raising awareness of the European elections. Among these, there was this project called My Vote 2014, who specifically aimed at raising awareness among young people and particularly first-time voters. The project actually was developed in close partnership with the European Youth Forum. This innovative website that we created allowed young voters, in this case defined as between 18 and 35 years old, to develop a basic or even better understanding of the functioning of the European Parliament. Users were able to cast their own votes on major issues dealt with by this institution, such as energy, such as tax, maternity leave, TTIP, immigration, and many others, and then see instantly which members of the European Parliament, as well as which parties as a whole, match their own preferences most closely. Throughout the whole process, the information was presented in an objective and fact-based manner, and the website was multilingual in order to reach as many citizens as possible across the EU. This voting quiz alone was used by around 350,000 people across the EU. The aim was to make young people aware of the direct connection between their votes in the EU elections and the outcome of the policies debated and voted in the European Parliament, and which would then, in a few years, affect their daily lives. This project of ours was the first ever voting advice website based on politicians' actual voting records rather than campaign promises. As we know, there can be many differences between the promises made before the elections and the actual facts of the politicians once they have taken office. For this reason, we're focusing on the facts, not the promises, and therefore we are confident that our tool is much more accurate than any other of this sort. Here at VoteWatch, we believe that in order to improve the quality of participation in the EU policymaking, especially among young voters, the civil society needs to benefit from quality information about what is actually going on in the institutions. And thanks to our experience in monitoring and reporting, and also our extensive data sets on which we base our analysis regarding Parliament's activities, we are in a unique position to help citizens understand how decisions in the European Parliament are made and how these impact on their daily lives. Moreover, since January 2015, VoteWatch Europe has taken on board highly qualified students through special education and qualification programs, such as the Erasmus Plus program that I was mentioning earlier. This has brought us new ideas and energy on board, while at the same time allowed us to raise awareness about the information that we produce and expand our network in the member states of the students. For the young Europeans that work with us, this has been a very enriching experience, and we highly encourage European students to take this opportunity offered by the Erasmus Plus program and others, and do internships abroad. Now, coming back to the institutions level, I think that the impact of the efforts that they have undertaken before the EU elections of 2014 is rather hard to measure. Only 28% of the age group between 18 and 24 years old turned out to vote in May 2014, which is slightly less than in 2009. However, one can argue that had the institutions not done anything about this, the figure could have dropped even lower. Citizenship education in schools can become an important tool in facilitating young people's understanding of the political processes. Nevertheless, young people learn about citizenship not only through lectures, but also through direct participatory activities in their school and in their local communities. Therefore, citizenship education activities can be successful if they are supported by a school environment where students are actually given the opportunity to experience the mechanisms of this democratic process. I'm talking about experience such as simulations and competitions between groups of students. It is also important to couple all of this with the understanding of young people's different attitudes toward political participation in order not to lose their potential in bringing about political and social change. I think that the new expressions of political action and communication, such as the social media, are not at all in contradiction with traditional means of participation, such as voting. On the contrary, they should be seen as complementary. And taking them as complementary tools would enable social engagement and the political participation of the youth. An important challenge for the institutions, as well as for the national and the local entities, resides in these institutions' ability to adapt and incorporate the new modes of participation chosen by young people. From the institutional perspective, the EU institutions allow young people to take part in the debates about the future of the Union through the so-called structural dialogues. These are meetings for continuous joint reflections between the institutions and the citizens on the priorities of the Union, the implementation of its programs, as well as the follow-up to all of these projects. The expectations for the coming years are that young people will get the chance and have the will to demonstrate that they indeed want to engage in developing the future of the Union and help the Union become more prosperous, more inclusive, and more innovative. I think that many youngsters have already expressed their desire to be more involved in the EU decision-making processes, and therefore the EU institutions really need to make these processes more accessible for the young people to express themselves and to participate and shape the future of the European Union.